Hi, I'm Cassie, and I'm part of Group C. One classroom management technique that I observed was all of our students were sitting in grouped desks. There were 4 groups, 2 groups of 4 and 2 groups of 6. And whenever the teacher would dismiss the students, she would always tell her ladies, the girls, to line up first. And then once all of them were lined up, she would tell the guys that they could go line up. And that usually worked pretty well, but I noticed that whenever the kids got really out of control and loud, her way of getting their attention was just to yell over them and kind of tease them a little bit. And I don't think that worked very well. I think a lot of times her comments made things worse than they already were. Like if a couple of the boys started talking while everyone was supposed to be working on their worksheets, then she would just yell over there like, "Stop talking, you need to be working on your work," or something. And she would, there was one time where she was yelling over because one boy was talking, and she was like, "You need to focus on your math because Ashanti just is not into you," talking about another little girl, and the whole class is like, "Ooh," and so it kind of made things worse. But sometimes, I mean, it did get their attention when she was yelling over them. For instructional strategies, LaPortia discussed how she used an inquiry strategy and made masks with her students. I also did something similar. I made masks with my 5th grade class that I worked with, and I used an experiential learning strategy. So I guided them through an online simulation of the process that was actually used by ancient Egyptians when they made their mummies. And so we went through that together, and they were experiencing what it would be like to make a mummy in ancient Egypt. And then after the simulation, I allowed them to make their own masks to represent their lives. These masks were models of the masks made for Egyptian mummies that they had seen as part of the process, and they were allowed to, like LaPortia said, they expressed themselves through these masks, and they were able to really be creative with it. And there was one little boy who really loves Alabama football, or he made his all red and white and drew the A on the top. And then there was a little girl that liked to sing, so she drew music notes on her mask, and so that went really well. Talking about assessment strategies, Sarah mentioned that she used exit slips, asking her 1st graders to write things that they had learned. We used exit slips too with our 5th graders, and we had the same question. We wanted them to write something that they learned, but it went really well. She said it didn't go well for her group, probably because they were little and didn't know what to do, but we gave note cards to all of our students, and we asked them to write 1 or 2 things that they had learned about Egypt, or their favorite thing that they had learned about Egypt, and we had some really good answers. Some of them wrote things like they remembered that mummies were buried on a specific side of the Nile River, or they remembered that Egyptians created the calendar as we know it. And so it really showed us that they were paying attention to even the details that we shared with them. And when they each studied their own pharaoh a little bit for one of our activities, where they made Facebook pages for different pharaohs, and a lot of the pharaohs from ancient Egypt it was a very different culture. So a lot of the pharaohs had many wives, hundreds of wives even, and they would marry. They tried to keep their royalty all within the family. So some of the students, a lot of the boys in particular, it was interesting to see that that's something that really stood out to the boys in the class, is that on their note card, many of them also mentioned that Egyptian pharaohs had many wives or had more than one wife, and the girls would put things more like some of the pharaohs were girls. They weren't all men. And so it was interesting to see the responses and the differences of what really stood out to each student. But I really liked LaPortia's idea of passing the ball around to talk about it instead of them just writing, because that sounds like a lot more fun. For planning, I like what Brooke said about having everything laid out and ready so the students wouldn't just be sitting there waiting on her. We did that too, but we did it a little bit differently. We had a table that we were sitting at when we weren't actually teaching, and we would lay out our stuff on that table, but we also helped each other a little bit. Like when it was my day to teach, my partner would pass out all of my materials and she'd collect things for me just at the appropriate times during the lesson. When we got there, we would talk about it and I'd say, okay, so my lesson is this and I've got these laid out in a certain way on order on the table, and so when I get to this point, I need this passed out, and so she would pass it out at the right point in the lesson and she would collect it for me, and then I did the same thing for her. So we kind of helped each other out, and that kept the pace going so that there weren't any dull times where they're just sitting there getting bored or distracted. They were always doing something, always had something to focus on, and everything was organized. And one struggle we really had with planning was we planned our lessons to last the whole hour, and we knew that things don't always go as planned, so we had some flexibility built in that would help if students worked more quickly and finished early than we expected, and also if they worked more slowly than expected, and so we would have to cut out some things. But we actually had to cut all of our lessons really short and improvise because we were never able to start on time. One day when we got there was a volunteer there reading Old Yeller, I think, to the kids, and that's a big chapter book, and so it took a while. We couldn't start until she was done, and she still had a couple chapters left, so we had to wait, and we had to do an hour lesson. It was my lesson. I had to do an hour lesson in like around 30 minutes, so that was kind of like difficult to figure out. It was a challenge, but I think it worked out pretty well. There was a really fun activity that I had to cut out that I was looking forward to, but I think that what we were able to do was really well executed. And there was another day where we came in and they were taking a test, so we had to wait, and we couldn't start until like 15 minutes late that day, so it was a little rough on our time for our planning, but it all worked out pretty well. And so I think it was challenging, but it was good.